in light of the pandemic. There's a very real sense of threat, lots of uncertainty and sudden change that we're all adapting to. And it's just acknowledging that this is affecting all areas of life. So outside of our work, it's affecting possibly family health. We might have concerns about our own health or other relatives. The significant restrictions on lifestyle and social activity. There can be the financial impact for individuals, and then recognising the stresses that may be coming from changes to our daily work practices at the hospital. So for lots of us, we might be working in unfamiliar work areas and roles, we may be redeployed to different teams, taking on new duties. And it's just recognising as well that staff may be working longer hours and be experiencing feelings of distress at providing services in a different way to maybe how they were doing before. And it's very normal to feel a range of intense emotions at the current time, and that they may change as we go through this, but typically feelings of stress, anxiety, anger, grief and sadness. So we just wanted to start with that little bit of background and just say again that responses to stress are varied and all are normal. You know, where if we're struggling at the moment, that is perfectly normal. We're all going through this, but it's acknowledging that our stress systems may be constantly online at the moment. So our nervous systems are firing because of this constant threat, and there may be a cumulative effect of the stress that we're going through. And we're often unaware of this gradual build-up of tension until we reach a certain point. So you might think of it like a stress glass, and there's a dripping tap of stress going into it, and it reaches a certain point and then spills over. And that's the point where we realise that we're really not coping so well. And this slide is just making the point that signs of stress are very varied, so different for different people, but stress affects all of these key areas. So it can affect us physically, so people might notice their sleep or appetite's affected. It can affect us emotionally, so for example, feeling more anxious and irritable. It can also affect our thinking skills. So we might notice that we are more distractible, we're not remembering things as well, or it can affect our behaviour. So things like we might notice we're drinking more, smoking, or withdrawing from the sorts of things that we usually do to help us cope with stress. And when we think about how to respond to enhance staff wellbeing, there is already a significant evidence base. So there are a number of policies, and there's significant literature already on promoting psychological wellbeing in NHS staff, and literature on staff burnout and stress, because it's acknowledged that generally working within the NHS is quite stressful. We're used to having high demands placed on us, and there are often limited resources. So there's stuff that's already available from the general literature, and then there's learning from more specific incidents like the SARS outbreak in 2003, and new learning that's coming out all the time from China and other places around COVID-19. So on the basis of that, organisations like British Psychological Society and NHS England's Health and Wellbeing Task Force are producing information all the time about what staff may be going through at the different stages of this process, and the kind of practical things that may help enhance wellbeing. So the key points that are coming out really, and we'll keep stressing this first one about physical safety and physical needs, is that number one, physical needs are the priority. So for someone to feel psychologically safe, they have to feel physically safe. And then psychological responses may vary by phase as we go through this process, and it's been broken down into three key phases: so preparation, action and recovery. And this is just visualization of that. So the idea of a preparation phase as we're anticipating the peak of the demand, the active phase where we're in the full throes of it, and then recovery as we come through the other side. And there are some ideas about what we might experience and see in staff at these different phases. So in this preparation phase, typically staff report very high levels of anticipatory anxiety, some feelings of excitement, planning, pushing themselves, and a sense of not feeling prepared because things are happening very quickly, new policies, ways of working are being pushed through very quickly. So that should feel familiar, because I think for most parts of the hospital we've already gone through that phase. And then the action phase has been broken down into 2 stages. So in the first stage, as we first enter it, there's this sense of collective rising to the challenge. So a sense of increased camaraderie and all working together to get through this. It can often lead to people responding quickly and maybe making more errors because there's not the headspace or the time to see the full options available, because people are having to come up with very quick solutions. People might also be feeling frustrated and feel quite confused about their role. And this stage is also typically associated with things like disagreement between groups, individuals feeling out of control, people starting to overwork, really starting to have those blurred boundaries, maybe around working in home time, not taking breaks. Work-home life tensions are typically reported, and because of this push to get things done and the pressure people are feeling, it's a time where there may be poor communication, as I said previously, more errors, and also a time when social norms and niceties may slip as people begin to feel more stressed and become more irritated with other people's behaviour. And the second phase is where we may see, it's associated with the highest psychological risk. So we may see a whole range of different presentations associated with people feeling more stressed. So things like anxiety, poor sleep, changes in behaviour, all those things that were on the earlier slide. It's also associated with feelings of disillusionment and exhaustion. So people have gone through this adrenaline-fueled first stage, and as it goes on, just start to feel really exhausted with it all. It's also recognised that people may neglect self-care at this stage. It's just not seen as a priority, and become feel disconnected from the work and start to engage in things that are maybe less helpful to them as the effects of stress keep building. And the recovery phase, the key message here, I think, is that the reactions that we see in the early stages of recovery are really varied, and that's quite normal. But the majority of people will feel able to cope. They'll show a resilient response to this. It's estimated that approximately 70% of NH staff will get through it. They'll report some positive changes. They'll report that their existing coping strategies were good enough to get them through. But it's also recognised that for a smaller number, there may be mild symptoms of ongoing distress, things that start to get in the way of their adaptive coping and recovery. So, for example, mild symptoms of anxiety, intrusive thoughts about what they should or ought to have done during this, feelings of shame and guilt, ongoing changes in behaviour. And then a smaller number again show more severe difficulties, moderate to severe difficulties. So the type of changes that have an impact on functioning at work and at home and may require psychological treatment. The other things just to say about the recovery stage is that research from other significant events that health professionals have gone through highlight that the impact on health professionals tend to be more delayed than in the general public. So although it's a very different type of trauma, evidence from things like the Manchester bombing show that health professionals' difficulties tend to lag behind the general public, and partly that's felt to reflect the fact that health professionals are more reluctant to disclose mental health issues. But it's just highlighting a need for the system to be aware of that and not just forget these conversations and the need to check in on people as soon as this is over. It's recognised that there's pressure on the system to get back to business as usual. There'll be a backlog and individuals may feel really pressured just to hit the ground running. And again, it's just highlighting that people will need time to stop and reflect on what's happened. And just to say a little bit maybe about people's vulnerability and that small number who might have ongoing difficulties. Vulnerability is generally associated with pre-existing mental health issues, with individuals' perception of threat. So it's just been suggested that people who are new to their role maybe, or to a team, who feel a little out of control and that they haven't the skills to meet the demands of the threat, may find it more difficult than, say, people who are in a more frontline stressful role. So maybe like a very well-trained supportive ICU team, and be more vulnerable, even though on the face of it their job doesn't look quite as stressful. So that individual's perception of the threat's really important. There's also the experience of secondary stresses, and that's the stuff that we often don't know as wellbeing leads and team leads, but thinking about the secondary impact of the COVID pandemic, so financial, relationship issues. And then in terms of ethnic minority groups, there's just a question mark about how psychological recovery may be, because it seems unfortunately that people from ethnic minorities have been disproportionately affected by the virus itself. There are recommendations and actions to protect wellbeing at all the different phases. So the things that we know are helpful are just listed here. Throughout preparation and action, key things are available, visible leadership, regular communication, regular information on psychological well-being, and within psychological medicine, that is definitely an approach we've taken, where we have a rolling programme of presentations, information about individual self-care. Physical safety needs, so that has to be a priority. So meeting people's basic requirements for breaks, food, snacks during their shift, PPE. Ensuring connection is essential as well. So through peer support, buddy systems, through the relationships that already exist within teams. We know those are hugely important for wellbeing. Provision of psychological care to patients and families, that has been flagged up as a really important area. If we can get that right, it reduces staff stress. And then just some really key points about normalising psychological reactions. So we know in the midst of this crisis, it's not helpful to mandate psychological intervention for everybody. It's really guarding against that surge to referring to a psychologist if you feel someone's struggling a bit, because the reactions may be perfectly normal given the stresses that we're under. And we need to think about offering formal psychological input in a stepped and coordinated way. It's also really helpful to check in and review needs of your teams through all these different phases, as things will be changing, and remembering how important pacing is. And you'll hear again and again, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And for recovery, it's all around giving time and offering a compassionate and flexible response. So this is guarding against that rush back to business as usual, and not giving people and teams the space to really reflect on how they're doing and what their support needs are. And that has to be individualised as well, because some people will want to access different forms of support. But we know reflection, space for processing experiences, organising learning events, thinking about what teams need next and what staff members need next is really important, and space for ongoing peer support. Okay, so we've just have that visualization, a bit like a pyramid. So this step psychological response, we said that the cornerstone is basic needs, physical resources, information, support, informal support, psychological first aid, and then the more formal psychological intervention is just that small top part of the pyramid. Okay, so I'm going to move the slides on and pass on to Audrey.
Thanks, Rachel. I hope everybody can hear me. So I'm Audrey Daisley. I'm a psychologist at the OCE. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might start to talk to colleagues, team members about well-being. And I guess I'm starting from a point of acknowledging that actually I know there's already lots of really good stuff going on within teams already, and that many people are feeling able and supported to and equipped to have these kind of conversations. And so for some of you this is a bit like revision and checking in, but we also know for others this is a new role that you may have taken on, that supporting staff well-being may feel a bit of a scary undertaking. And so we hope that there's some pointers in here for people who feel perhaps less experienced at doing this kind of work. So the important thing we know is that how staff well-being is approached and offered is a really important factor in ensuring good outcomes for colleagues. So the fact that OUH has prioritised staff well-being is making it possible for people to access help and support is already a very important message to staff, and will support people to access those resources and feel that the organisation is taking care of us. A good starting point is something referred to as having psychologically savvy conversations with teams or with individuals is a good starting point, and I'll talk a bit about what that entails. I think it's also recommended that we try to nip things in the bud where possible, so to start conversations early about well-being, to normalise the talking about how we're feeling, how we're doing as individuals and teams is really useful. And then I'm going to share an acronym that might help just keep some of that in mind. I don't have any control of the slides, so I have to ask Rachel to move them on for me.
Sorry.
Next one, thank you. So, as I said earlier, some of us may feel okay about opening up well-being conversations, and some of us may feel not as confident to do that, and it can be anxiety provoking, especially if you might be feeling some of the same worries that you think staff members are going to share. And actually that's an asset, because it means you're likely to come to it from a point of much more understanding and compassion, because essentially we are all in this together, and most of us are experiencing very similar feelings at the moment. So the problem is though, is that most times when we're busy, when we perhaps don't know each other very well, if someone asks us how we are, we will normally reply with, I'm fine. And you can see from just this little diagram here that, of course, underlying that sort of response that I'm fine, maybe a whole other range of feelings and reactions that might be worth us trying to tap into. And so the important thing is, though, is many of us will be fine. And I know there's the statement that it's okay not to be okay, but I think it's also important that it's okay to be okay. Some people are kind of built for this, and some people are kind of wired for this and thrive on crisis, and others don't. And so it's okay to be how we are at the moment. And I think the important thing though is that sometimes someone might tell us they're fine, but we have a sense that they might not be, or we're hearing from others that they might not be, or we're worried about how a team is functioning. They don't seem to be doing things as fluently or as well as they were before, and we may want to ask more about that. So how do we move beyond the kind of I'm fine response? Rachel, could you move the slide? Thank you. So again, there's no magic here. These are just some straightforward questions, but sometimes they can help structure how you might approach the situation. And so I guess it's it's helpful just to kind of keep things open, maybe to tell somebody or a team you've noticed that things don't feel okay or seem okay, and ask what's been concerning you or worrying you. It's important just to leave that open and not to second guess, and not to ask, is it this or is it this? Maybe saying, I noticed that when we, did the morning briefing this morning, that you seemed a bit distracted or upset. Can you tell me what was on your mind? Perhaps to ask someone how they've been taking care of themselves, how they've been managing with the changes recently. It's quite important after these conversations to ask people about what they're going to do next, because it can be difficult for people to leave these conversations perhaps worrying about, maybe I said too much, maybe I shouldn't have told the wellbeing lead how I'm feeling, maybe as a team we shouldn't have shared what's been going on. And people may kind of wonder and worry about things later. So maybe to ask, what are you going to do later? Who's going to be around? It's important if you're worried about somebody, particularly in the last meeting I was in this week, the issue came up of some staff members just feeling they just couldn't really manage the job as it was at the moment, or they didn't want to work with patients who were COVID positive. And maybe asking those people, are you going to come into work tomorrow? What are you thinking will happen tomorrow? What are you going to do? And how can I help? To try to open up that part of the conversation. I think while we're asking these questions and trying to gather as much information to help us understand where an individual or where a team is coming from, is to hold in mind the importance of just normalizing what you're hearing, trying to accept what people are telling us, even if it's very hard for us to relate it to our own experience or understanding, or if you feel they've got misconceptions. Just trying to understand that and hold that, and not challenging what they're saying too quickly, or trying to rush in with solutions or options. I think we know that when people do disclose information relating to distress, how we hear it initially is very, very important. The next slide, please. One of the questions that we're asked a lot is when to be concerned about a team member. And it's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because many of us will be working with colleagues that we know very well. And so we will already know, because either they've approached us or we can see that things don't seem right. But we may also be working with people that we don't know well. And so it's very difficult to know what might have changed for them. So I think in these situations, it's always good to, talk to somebody else who knows them well and ask a bit more. It's important to try to get the right help at the right time. And so there's a real difficult balance, I guess, for people to strike between not rushing in to do too much, but also then not doing anything at all. And I guess one of the things that we would say is, if you are worried, and you're not quite sure what to do next, is to link in with your psychological medicine link person and maybe talk through a situation. So I think we need to talk about these things more on an individual basis. This is just general advice. But the key thing is for us to prevent a crisis if we can, for individuals or teams. I think what helps us consider whether we need to be a little bit more worried about somebody is when someone's displaying really intense levels of emotion that just has a kind of real gut feel to you that this is different from what you're hearing and seeing in other colleagues around them, that something just feels different. And I think you'll know that when you hear it. I think also to be mindful if they describe their distress or their worries about COVID as really having a very significant impact on how they're managing day to day. So if they tell you they're not sleeping or they're not eating, or that they're struggling to carry out their role effectively, if they're making errors or turning up late, and when that distress is persistent, I think particularly when people have had a lot of access to psychological self-care, and if we're seeing that people are still struggling, then it can be worth having more of a kind of discussion with them and with others about what they might need. Have the next slide, please. Thank you. Oh, it's gone. Thank you. So if we use the acronym PIES, it just helps us think about some of the things to, if you like, run through in our own minds when we're thinking about whether teams or individuals need help. So P is for proximity, and I think this is an interesting one that has started to come out of the research. A lot of the research is from the armed forces about how they manage staff during difficult crises and times of stress. And one of the things that's coming out of that is that if someone is struggling in the workplace, it can feel like it's the right thing to do to send them home. Quite often, as a manager myself, in the past, if someone tells me that they're struggling with something, I might suggest that they take some time off, that they take some self-care measures, and that they maybe take a few days off sick and go home and try to kind of use some strategies and come back when they're ready. In this kind of situation, it's actually recommended that we don't do that because it can be counterproductive. Again, I think it needs to be judged on an individual basis, but this is some general advice. So, for example, the advice is actually not to send people away initially, partly because it can impact on them later, that they start to feel guilty about not being part of the team. Even if they might have some initial relief, the evidence suggests that they can start to be worried about not pulling their weight, worry that the team may be angry with them or judging them harshly. So what the advice is initially is to try to keep people close to the team and to those that know them well, so they can still benefit from that connection, and then to talk with them about adjusting their role, to redeploy them to something else within the team, maybe a less direct clinical role if that's possible, so that they remain within the team and they have a purpose. And it's important just to keep reviewing that with them to see how that's working. It's also important when thinking of proximity to think about our colleagues who are not currently physically in the workplace. So staff who are working from home, it's easy to forget that or assume that they don't need support because they're not in the trust buildings. There'll be those colleagues of ours who are self-shielding and maybe long-term, and really important to decide as a wellbeing lead how many of those people are within your teams who are working from home, who are shielding, who are maybe off for other reasons, so on maternity leave or other types of leave. Kind of know who those people are and make a plan for how we stay in touch with those people. And also thinking about team members who are redeployed. So that came up when we presented this on Tuesday. We had quite a lot of discussion around staff who are redeployed. One from the perspective of how it feels to be redeployed into a new team at a time of kind of heightened stress, when all the usual induction procedures are not really possible, or what it feels like to be a team receiving redeployed staff. I attended the trust briefing this morning, and it's looking as if maybe there's moves to send some people back who've been redeployed, so this may become less of an issue, but it could be uncertain for a while about the movement of staff, and so that's something within your own teams. It's important to think about how you keep in touch with colleagues who are not physically present in the teams right now. The next slide, please. Thanks. If we go back to the acronym, immediacy, so I for immediacy, is the idea to try to respond quickly when we feel that somebody does need more support. It's important to judge, perhaps with your psychological medicine link person and with other services available, such as occupational health or the employee assistance program, what might be right for somebody at the right time. Expectancy is important when we're having conversations with our colleagues and with our staff, is, to acknowledge that things are going to be tough for a while, and there's probably, there's lots more uncertainty at the moment, but actually to convey the whole time the expectations that things will get better for us and we will get through this. And I think we can't underestimate the value of having that hope at the moment on all our well-being. Next one, please. And going back to what Rachel said earlier, we often look for sophisticated solutions, and sometimes those are needed when people are struggling more. But actually, the simple things, the basic things become the not so sort of basics. You know, they become really important. So as we've said before, and we're emphasising it again, the first line of good psychological support is adequate PPE and safe staffing levels so that people feel equipped to do the job. That we ensure, and I think we are doing that at OEH, that people have access to food and snacks and drinks more than they've perhaps ever needed, because the pace is more intense. And encouraging and reminding ourselves about the need to maintain good self-care routines. And most of us know about the importance of a good night's sleep and a good diet and limiting exposure to the news. Whether we practice that or not is another thing, and we probably shouldn't assume that we're all doing that, and try to support each other to try to maintain those routines as far as possible so we feel ready to come to the workplace. So I guess as wellbeing leads, it can feel you know, you've got a multitude of roles within this position. I guess the main things that we see is about being available. So as Rachel said earlier, being visible, being available, letting people know that you're the wellbeing lead and that you're how people can contact you if they need to, and also maybe what you'll be doing proactively in that role. Take time to observe what's going on. If you're attending any meetings, just look at how people are interacting, how people seem. Take time to listen, and as I said, not to rush in to offer solutions. Your role isn't to solve anything, but to be a link person to access solutions. This is a team thing, and we have to support each other, and we shouldn't feel responsible for solving every team's difficulties. Where you can, hold compassion for what people are worried about. Again, as a manager, it can be really difficult because you could have, you know, other concerns, and you know, people coming forward with difficulties or concerns may clash with your priorities, and it's really important to be aware of that and to still be able to hold that space for them while they talk that through. It's really important to look after yourself, recognise the demands on you doing your main role as well as taking on supporting wellbeing, and being aware of the, you know, the number of emails that we're all receiving has hugely increased because so many people are working online, and do link in with your psychological medicine psychologist or psychiatrist if you want to talk things through. Next slide. So we've added some resources here that that people might want to think about and to share. I think this presentation is going to go, we hope, onto the COVID staff resource page on the intranet, so that you can access it again, or you can share it as you feel is appropriate. Any more slides, Rachel? I can't remember what's next. So this is just to point out the range of options that the NHS are making available to staff, and those options seem to be increasing all the time, really. So I think we have a whole range of local options, and then there are lots of websites that staff members can access as well, in addition to what's available locally. And I think the good thing is there's a range of sort of face-to-face and not necessarily face-to-face options, because not everybody wants to have something that's face-to-face with somebody else.
And I think the feedback so far, so excuse me, I was on a webinar yesterday about the NHS Horizons, NHS England resources. So going back, oh sorry, wrong way. Oh sorry, I don't know how to. I'm so sorry. Right, bear with me. I knew I shouldn't have messed with the slides. Let's go back to the slideshow. Current slide. Can you see the slides now?
Yeah,
Go.
fine.
Great. So just a quick update yesterday from NHS Horizons. They were just saying that one, as Audrey was saying, new resources are coming online all the time. So things like the bereavement support line, which is being hosted through Sobel, is just online, and there are also common rooms for NHS staff to come together in groups, and that they're facilitated by psychologists. And they were just saying, really, when they've looked at the data, they've had a huge amount of interest in their kind of online self-help resources. So things like people logging onto those two sources that are mentioned there, Practitioner Health and people.nhs UK. Actually, there's not been a huge uptake for things like the telephone call, phone counselling yet, but I think that's just what we'd expect, that people are, you know, doing their own research, looking what's out there, using these self-help measures. But they're bringing more things online all the time, and if you follow them on Practitioner Health, that website there, you'll get all the latest resources.
Thanks, Rachel.
Sorry, that's the last slide.
So we just wanted to end with some words that we like, to kind of sort of motivational to keep things in perspective, because it can feel overwhelming. And so we've just ended with some words by a poet to kind of encourage us. That's kind of all we wanted to say. We've still got a little bit of time, and we're